If I could have your attention, please. We had planned about a half hour of kind of mingling time and answering any questions along the back, but it seems that you guys are ahead of the curve. You got here early, so we're going to go ahead and get started early, with our goal being to get everyone home in time for Jeopardy. So let's see if we can make that happen. First of all, I know a lot of people are here because when you hear stormwater, the concerns are obvious, and we're glad to have you here. We're glad to see the turnout, and it's our job, hopefully, to basically share some information with you this evening. Most importantly, tonight is about what a stormwater utility can be and how it can serve the city. This is not a specific discussion about stormwater in a particular area or a small corner or a larger aspect. So I know some people are here, you have questions about the golf course issue. And I want to let you know that there are 2 scheduled meetings that will be focusing on that particular golf course conversion issue. They're scheduled for February 26th and 28th, 5:30 p.m. right here at the high school. And so I don't know about you, but if I had a high school this nice, I might have stayed a few more years. But we appreciate the facilities tonight. I also want to recognize Deputy Mayor Peter Flynn is here tonight. Mr. Flynn, there you are, back here. Thank you very much for taking the time to be here tonight. Let me start with introductions. First of all, my name is Tim Hancock. I'm with Stantec. Stantec was engaged by the city to look at the option of a stormwater utility. Just in case you aren't familiar with us, Stantec is a worldwide firm, over 22,000 employees, architects, engineers, planners, but most importantly, we have offices in Naples and Fort Myers. We've had a presence in Southwest Florida since 1956, and so we've got some local knowledge. I'm a Florida native. I've been in Southwest Florida for 30 years. Doesn't mean I know your backyard better than you do, but at least I know one thing: it's Florida, it's flat. So we'll be getting into that a little bit more. Team introductions, my co-presenter tonight, Mr. Jared Beck. Anyway, let me introduce Molly Williams. Molly is our stormwater practice leader for our water group in Stantec. So everything stormwater, Molly knows it. So, you know, when it comes to making water run downhill, she's an expert. So,
it's flat.
And we joke all the time, civil engineering is simple. If you can't get it to run downhill by gravity, use a pump. So there's your 2 options. All right. We also have Mr. Kyle Goodwin and Shauna Chasen, both civil engineers in the back there with Stantec as well. A couple of folks are here from city staff, but really our job is not to put a target on their back tonight as much as it is to try and address the stormwater utility issues and answer any questions you may have. First things first, restrooms and fire exit. We have 2 restrooms over on this wall over here, and if there's a fire, that way, okay? You know, get out. So I think we've covered the safety issue for tonight. Our agenda tonight is pretty simple. Over the next 20 or 25 minutes, we're going to walk you through what a stormwater utility could be if one were to be implemented in the city of Bonita Springs. No decision has been made on that. The whole purpose of this study is to look at a stormwater utility, to better understand it, and then make a determination whether or not it's a good fit for the city. And we have no stake in that. Whether you and your elected officials choose to go forward or not is entirely up to you. And then following the presentation, probably the most important thing we're going to ask you to do tonight is, some of you at the end of the presentation may feel like you've got your information, you're good to go, and you're welcome to leave. Others may have questions. So 2 things are going to happen at the end of the presentation. We're going to pass out comment cards to each of you. It is very, very important for your elected officials that if you have an opinion, a comment, an issue, please put it in writing for us tonight. We'll be handing out pens and comment cards. Please go through those. Let us know what your thoughts are. That's going to be our best way to reach back to the elected officials and give them direct information. You can ask questions. We'll be staged in the back of the room as well. If you have specific questions, please come see us. But the best way to get your issues and concerns known are going to be those comment cards. So I'm going to ask you to take those seriously and please use them to your advantage. So let's go ahead and talk about why we're here. Currently, the city maintains a publicly owned portion of the stormwater management system. They fund this effort mainly with property taxes and, to a lesser extent, gas taxes. The problem is, as the system ages, repair and replacement costs continue to rise, and the city is simply looking at a stormwater utility that could possibly fund a portion or all of the city's stormwater-related expenses. So tonight, we're going to talk to you a little bit about what a stormwater utility is. We're We're going to talk about funding options and how they might apply to you and the city. And we're also going to do our best at the conclusion to address any questions or concerns. And we'll be taking those questions one-on-one. Our team will be in the back of the room. Please come see us at the conclusion of the presentation if we can help you. Jared?
All right, so let's just go to the basics on why the city manages the stormwater system. And the first one is basically about your safety. It's your personal safety as residents in the community, but it's also about the safety and protection of your homes. So it's also, let's start with that. It's really about protecting you as residents, but also protecting your private property. The second part is the safety throughout our entire community, and that can relate specifically to our roadways. So I'm going to guess that probably there is no one that walked here tonight. Everyone came in a car. Well, think about when you're driving down the roads, and we have the standing water. You'll see that perhaps more frequently as we get into rainy season. But that, of course, impacts not only you, but it does affect things such as police and the fire, ambulance, essential services within the cities. And so, most likely, when you are driving and you do see flooded roads, which we do, it's probably a result of a catch basin that's clogged. There's also a basic public health and welfare element within the community. We can go to the next slide. And then there's a water quality and environmental component. Who has lived here for more than a couple of years? So most of you. So most of you probably know we have had impaired waterways throughout Southwest Florida for a number of years, and we particularly had a couple of significant years, the last 2 or 3. So the proper filtration of water before it discharges is an essential part of maintaining the environment. And of course, here within this region, that also impacts our recreational ability to enjoy the waterways that we have. More so here in Southwest Florida, the water is a major part of our economy, and that doesn't impact just people here when we have poor water quality in terms of their spending. It's also having an impact future years down the roads as people think about, do we come to Southwest Florida? So a couple of other reasons why the city manages stormwater. The first one is in the early 1970s, there was a Clean Water Act that was put into place, which the city is required to comply with and follow reporting. They're also required to perform stormwater management activities that comply with the stormwater discharge permit that the city has itself. And if anyone's been listening to some of the news since we've had the elections this year and a new governor's office is in office, you've probably heard a lot of talk about water quality and the emphasis that he's placed on it, particularly then with the impacts we've had the last couple of years. There's likely to be some potential increased legislation coming through this year that the city will also have to comply with.
And I want to apologize for all the feedback on the sound system tonight. There is a speaker system in here. Early on, we got some folks telling us that it wasn't working very well, so we brought our backup in. Normally, we have the speakers far forward so we don't get feedback, but we're doing as best we can, so I may be out in the hallway the next time we talk about this. But let's talk a little bit about Stormwater 101. What is stormwater in the state of Florida? Now, I said I'm a Florida native. Do we have any other Florida natives in the room, born in the state of Florida? Yes. Ellie, Lance. Yeah.
Tim, now this beat a workshop we did 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, that's true. We had 143 people in a workshop. I said, how many people were born in Florida? Not a single hand. Not one. Okay, so for my Florida native friends, that thing right there, that's called a hill. Yeah. Some people from Ohio told me about those. We don't have them. But I think this helps to illustrate a little bit about how our stormwater system works. And every neighborhood, every part of the city is a little bit different, but there are systems and elements of the system I want you to understand. First and foremost, storm drains. This is the point of entry. So your upper left, what you've got is typically if you have curbing or sidewalks, you'll have storm drains. That's where water enters the system from impervious surfaces. It then travels through a system of pipes or swales. Swales, when they look pretty, you call them swales. When they look ugly, you call them ditches, but they're the same thing. They're open bodies that convey water. So all the ditches, all the swales you see don't just hold water, but they're meant to convey it. Where do they convey it to? Typically, they're intercepted by what's called a detention area or detention system. In Florida, most detention areas that we think of, we call lakes. And that's what your realtor called it when they charged you $10,000 extra to live on it. They called it a lake. Because if you call it a stormwater pond, you don't get the 10 grand. So, but they're called detention systems. They have a purpose, and they're both wet and dry. So sometimes you'll see them with no water in them. Sometimes you'll see them, they appear as lakes. Those detention areas serve two purposes. They temporarily store water before moving and discharging it, and they also help to treat the water through two methods. Number one is they allow hard metals to settle out, and that's a good thing. The second thing is sunlight penetrating the water helps break up certain elements in the water that are not good. So they're a way of using kind of a natural looking feature to help clean and purify water to some degree. Then leaving the detention system, you can see that concrete box in the bottom. That's what's called an outfall or an outfall structure. As the water in the detention area or the lake rises as we get more and more rain, it'll crest over a point of that box and begin falling into that box and moving. It then moves through a conveyance system. Ultimately, we have structures. There are all kinds of structures. Structures can be fixed crest weirs, which really means just a flat area that when water rises, it crests over. Some of them are notched, which means they allow for a smaller amount of water to release when it's not that heavy rain. As the rainfall increases, more and more water is allowed to go over it. So the structures have to be maintained. Then ultimately, the outfalls. This is where the water ultimately leaves your system and goes into what are called the receiving waters. The beauty of the state of Florida is that most of our receiving waters is where our value of living in this state come from. They are the Imperial River. They are Spring Creek. And in many ways, they are our beaches and our near beach waters. They are our mangroves. They are our backwaters. Those are our receiving waters. And we do all of this in an attempt to make sure the water that reaches those receiving waters is as clean as possible within reason. Obviously, you can't cover everything. And to avoid issues of water quality that affect the community. So let's talk a little bit about what a stormwater utility is. Now that we all are engineering experts on stormwater, we're going to talk about what a utility does. A stormwater utility is simply an approach to funding stormwater management, and this is a key, with dedicated revenues. The monies created for a stormwater utility must be spent on stormwater functions. Typically, it's on user fees based on a property's contribution. How much water does your property cast off? That is your contribution. Examples of this are water meters. You're charged and you get a water bill every month, and it's based on the amount of water you consume or use, because we can measure it. So you pay for what you use. Same with sewer. Solid waste is another fee that government charges. You know when they're going to pick up your trash, you know the size of your trash can, and you pay it on your tax bill every year. Stormwater and a stormwater utility takes that same approach. What it does is it measures the amount of stormwater that comes off of your property, and we'll get into how we do that a little bit later. And then instead of using property taxes, or the value of your home in essence, as the basis for what you're charged, it creates fees based on the amount of impervious you have. That in a nutshell is what a stormwater utility is intended to do. So why even look at one? Well, first of all, we mentioned the dedicated stable funding. You're going to see a little bit later the work that the city has done in leveraging grant money. One of the things a dedicated stable funding source like a stormwater utility does is improve your opportunities to get state and federal grant funds. If it's constructed properly, it's fair, it's equitable, it's transparent. It's also based on local needs. You can actually localize within basins or even neighborhoods how to address certain needs within a stormwater utility. Matching grant funds for grant programs we talked about. Water quality and flood protection projects are one of the top tiers that people look at as to why move toward a stormwater utility for funding. You can fund your operation and maintenance and replacement, and you can recognize and encourage on-site management. In other words, if you live in a community where you manage stormwater within your community, that can be recognized and actually can reduce your stormwater fee.
So I'm going to actually repeat a little bit of what Tim said, and that relates to a stormwater utility being equitable within a community. So today there are nearly, I think it's almost 200 cities in the state of Florida that have gone to a utility system. And the reason is that for those that don't, when you pay your stormwater sort of fee or whatnot based on your property taxes today, that's actually based on the property value of your home. When you move towards a utility, instead of looking at the value of your property, it looks towards the impact you have, which is basically your impervious area. So in more effect, the level of intensity that you have on your property relates then to the fee that is charged within that. The additional element that Tim had mentioned, and part of what makes this so equitable and why communities are going towards it, is that it allows for a credit system. So if you're doing systems within your community or within your property that does do some level of stormwater management, then there's an option to be recognized in implementing this.
When we talk about transparent and accountable, what that means is if you were to create a stormwater utility, it becomes what's called an enterprise fund. In other words, you're charging a fee and in essence providing a service. Any enterprise fund in the state of Florida requires that funds collected for that purpose can only be spent for that purpose. This is very different than property taxes, for example, where you pay your property taxes and they go to a myriad of different things. Stormwater fees collected can only be used for improvement or stormwater improvements within the community. And the level of fees must be based on the needs of the system and the contribution of each property owner. So let's walk through this a little bit more carefully. How does it work? Okay, the property on the left here, that is a typical single-family home sitting on 0.15 acres. The property on the right is an industrial or commercial property sitting on 1 acre of land. What you see here is the amount of impervious on each of those two properties in the orange. So on the left, it's got 0.15 acres of impervious. In a 1-inch storm event, it will cast off 3,900 gallons of stormwater. Does that number surprise anybody? How many 1-inch events do we have around here? Seems like one every couple of weeks. In the summertime, one a day. Feels that way anyway. Well, if that surprises you, the 1 acre over here of impervious will cast off 26,000 gallons of water in a 1-inch rain event. However, if you're funding your stormwater needs through property taxes, which are based on home value, these two properties will pay the exact same amount of money towards stormwater. So 20 years ago, before we had the ability to easily measure how much impervious is on a piece of property, this is kind of the way you did it, because you couldn't really go out and survey every single property in the whole city or the whole county. But now we can figure out how much impervious is on a piece of property. So what we're saying here is the value of a property has nothing to do with its stormwater contribution. And the stormwater utility is based solely on the contribution of stormwater runoff from a given property, and that's how your fee is based, not on property value.
So the slide you were just looking at, the orange represented all of the impervious area, basically where water runs off. So now as we take a look at this slide, this is the city of Bonita Springs. Everything that's orange represents impervious lands or impervious area within the city limits. So on the right-hand side, you'll see a table which we're gonna sort of tie into the next slide. Basically, out of all of the impervious area within the city, roughly 55%, 54% of it, or just about half of it, comes from single-family homes. There's an additional 15%, or approximately 15%, that comes from a higher density residential. So that's going to be largely your condominiums and whatnot. And then about 30%, or almost a third of it, that comes from your industrial uses. The balance is really government and institutional. Molly, if we can...
Well, actually, before we get off this slide, the way in which this is determined is through, I'm going to use it, I'll probably just kill it, but it's aerial spectrography. I get that right, Lance?
Aerial imagery.
Aerial imagery, thank you. And the people who do that amazing work are people like Lance. And so Lance is here. So if you want to know through aerial imagery how it's calculated, afterwards, Lance will run you in circles. And he'll explain it to you in ways that I don't even know how to explain. But the bottom line is we're able now to use, because digital photographs are taken on a routine basis, we're able to use digital photography to interpret impervious. This was something that became known to me when I was in the desert of Saudi Arabia during Desert Storm. And they found out that for the first time using digital photography on the battlefield, our uniforms showed up like you can't imagine. You know, you could see our uniforms because the old camouflage was designed for basically standard photography. But with digital photography, we wore uniforms called chocolate chips. You could pick us out like that. And so that's why our military wears uniforms now that have digital pixelation in them. So it's the same principle, except here nobody dies. Here it's just basically digital imagery determining impervious areas.
All right, so Molly, can we go to the next slide? So we're going to spend a minute on this. Now remember on the last slide what we were looking at was over half the impervious area within the city came from single-family residential, roughly an additional 15%, so almost 70% of the impervious area comes from residential. Now, if you look on the left-hand side of your screen, this pie chart basically translates that same table. The blue is your residential, combined single-family, as well as your condominium. And then everything that's in the gray, that represents your commercial or industrial properties and their impervious impact within the city. And then there's a small little sliver, the orange, that represents government and institutional. Now, as we were talking the last couple slides about equity, if you take a look at the pie chart on your right, that represents where the funding is coming from for stormwater today. So while there's just shy of 70% of the impervious area in the city comprised from residential, almost 95% of the revenue for stormwater is funded by residential. Now, conversely, you have almost 30% of the impervious area within the city is generated from commercial or industrial properties, yet that accounts for only 7% of the revenue that's generated. So it really goes back to the aerial photography that Tim was talking about, having the equity. We're in a place in time where we're able to drive down and get more detailed on this, and the utility reflects that.
And if the city does choose to create a stormwater utility using the methods and means that most other communities are using, you will see these two pie charts become to look more similar. So instead of having a preponderance of residential properties funding through property taxes a stormwater, it'll look a little more balanced. You'll get something closer to what the actual impervious ratios are. So ideally, you'll match these two things up. So why consider stormwater utility? I'm guessing everyone is here because they have their own personal story about stormwater. Somehow it's touched you. It may have touched your knees, okay? But it's amazing how things fade in memory. You know, it wasn't that long ago we were talking about significant fish kills on the beach. In recent years, what has happened, particularly in the city of Bonita, is when you have significant back-to-back events like we did in the storm prior to Irma and then Irma, is it really exposes the flaws. It makes things a little clearer as to what the priorities need to be. And with those solutions, some of them are very, very specific. Some of them are down to a neighborhood level, not a citywide level. And so that's really something that was learned in that process. A stormwater utility will not keep storms from happening. It's not going to keep water from piling up. But if it's properly applied and it's used, it can actually improve the conditions for the community going forward. We talked about better technology, allowing for more accurate assessments of where the stormwater comes from. That's part of this process as well. And you know, we hear a lot of talk at the federal level and even the state level, with the exception of we've actually heard some dollars being applied now. We hope that happens. But usually when the government says, I'm gonna help you with that, that means they're gonna give you a book of new regulations. And those new regulations, the city staff are gonna have to figure out how to follow those regulations. Now, we don't know what those regulations are gonna be, but when Uncle Sam comes to Bonita to help you, he's gonna give you regulations, and your city staff is gonna have to follow those. Usually there is some type of monitoring, study, or application cost associated with that. We don't know what those are gonna be. But when they do come, if you have a stormwater utility in place, you have the ability to fund them in an equitable manner. So those are some of the things we just wanted to remind you. Everyone remembers it was only a year and a half ago, but it's amazing how quick it fades from memory, that the conditions we were in, and wouldn't it be nice to have a way to maybe address some of those issues a little bit differently in the future. And so, actually let's go one more slide, and then I want to come back to this one. So I want to talk about this a little bit. Jared, I'll jump into this one. This is what you currently pay for stormwater services in the city of Bonita Springs. And it falls into basically three categories. We're going to call category A, these are your operating expenses that are paid for out of the general fund. What general fund means is property taxes. So when you see general fund or ad valorem, it means property taxes. So you have $883,000 a year going towards operating expenses for your stormwater system. And your city is meeting all of its permit requirements. So, you know, hats off to them. You have a second funding mechanism, which is your gas tax. And currently you have $300,000 coming out of your gas taxes, which are paid by everybody who purchases gas in the city of Bonita Springs, for capital maintenance, repair, and replacement. So there's two funding pots. Your third item is what's called potential capital. What potential capital is, it is matching grant funds. It's where the city of Bonita comes up with $1 and the state matches it with 3 or 4. And you guys have gotten very, very good at this, and we're going to look at that in a little bit. So as we talk about the 3 different categories of spending, remember category A, operating expenses. You're currently spending $883,000 a year coming out of your property taxes. You have $300,000 a year coming out of your gas taxes. And in last year's budget in particular, you had $500,000 allocated for those matching funds. And I just want to make sure we're getting that right. I got a sideways look, so I'm mostly right. Okay, close enough. Let's go back to the previous slide. I want to talk about that third category, that potential capital, because in our opinion, in looking at everything you're doing, and the city is doing a great job with the money they have. And that's why I stand by the door, you know. The planned capital funding expenditures, the city has identified over the next 10 years, significant amount of projects that are necessary, and they total about $39 million. The plan to fund those is to do what the city has done very successfully in the past, and that is to use small amounts of local dollars to leverage state or federal grant funds. And you have an opportunity to do this, and you've been doing it, and doing a great job with it. But the question is, in order to fund the $39 million of projects, and not all of those grants will be issued. It's a little bit of a wish list at times, but let's assume some of them are going to be made available. In order to get 27, you've got to come up with 8, give or take. So where are you going to get the $8 million from? Currently, right now, every year, your council has to wrestle with that question. If there are, because they don't have the funding sources they have are property taxes and gas taxes, and you already see where they're going. So the question is, year to year, they have to figure out, how are we going to fund it? If there's a grant opportunity out there, how do we go after it? What a stormwater utility can do for you is it can help you meet that gray area with a dedicated funding source. And here's what a dedicated funding source does to you, and here's why 180 communities in the state of Florida have done this. A dedicated funding source is a box on the application for grant funds that you can either check or not check. And if you're using property taxes, you can't check that box. Property taxes are not considered to be a dedicated funding source. A stormwater utility that charges based on a fee is. So what it can do is it can help you have a higher percentage of grant funds being received by the city. I don't have any empirical data for you, but as someone who, our firm fills these applications out for our clients all the time, if they have a stormwater utility, we check that box, and it tells the grant issuer that yes, we have the funds available, dedicated to match the fund.
Well, in the other add-on to that, and I do an awful lot of grant workers too, having the dedicated funding source gives that grantor the awareness that you have many years of revenue coming in. So it also increases not only the ability to access funds, but to potentially access funds for projects that are much larger in their cost that will take multiple years to implement. So it's both in getting it, but getting bigger amounts for bigger projects.
Okay, so we've talked about how you would create a stormwater utility. We've talked about the impervious calculations that go into it, and we've talked about how the money can be used. All right, so let's start boiling it down a little bit for what does this mean for you as a resident in the city of Bonita Springs. So, one of the things we do is we have to develop in a stormwater utility what's called an ERU. That's an equivalent residential unit. That's like your base number, if you will, or an average number. Typically what you do is you look at all of the single family and low density homes, you take all the impervious, you divide it by the number of homes, and you come up with an average. And in the city of Bonita Springs, that was a very nice bell-shaped curve. And the middle point of that is what's called an ERU. And for the city of Bonita, it's 4,500 square feet of impervious on a given lot. Some are gonna be a little smaller, some are gonna be a little bit bigger. But on average, 4,500 square feet. And by the way, that's your home, that's your driveway, that's your pool or patio, that's, that fire pit you put in the backyard, all that stuff that water hits and runs off, that makes up that 4,500 square feet. So single-family residential or low-density residential would be assessed 1 ERU. And rather than carving it up, that's just one number across the board. Condominiums, typically high-rises that have smaller footprints, they would be assessed 0.4 ERUs. So if your stormwater fee was $10, an ERU would be $10, and the high-rise condo would pay $4. Now, non-residential or commercial properties they vary much more. So they are calculated individually as a function of ERUs. Let's go to the next slide. So here's how that works. Let's assume on the left is a typical ERU in the city of Bonita Springs. Let's say that's 4,500 square feet. On the right is a commercial property. Well, commercial properties have typically larger buildings, more parking areas, more impervious surfaces. So what we do is we divide that 4,500 into the amount of impervious over here. So if on the left it's 4,500 square feet, and on the right it's 45,000, that property would be charged 10 ERUs. So that $10 that would be 1 ERU becomes $100 for the commercial property. So that's how it's divvied up. It's all based on how much impervious you have. And for commercial properties, it becomes how many of those ERUs, if we add them up or divide them in, how you're assessed. So the real $64 million question is, what's this going to cost me? And the answer is, I don't know. But I can tell you, based on what your current funding levels are, there are 3 ways you could look at this. And remember we talked about A, operating expenses? These are the $883,000 that are currently coming out of your property taxes. If you were to fund your stormwater operations with a stormwater utility instead of property taxes, that would be $26 a year for 1 ERU. So if you're in a single family home, you're going to pay $26 a year instead of paying whatever you would pay through property taxes. On the maintenance, repair, and replacement, it comes out of your gas taxes. If you were, instead of funding it through gas taxes, to do it through the utility, it would be $9. And this is the one that the potential capital that really catches my eye, because this is the one that you can use to leverage the state and federal grant funds to a great degree. The $500,000 that's in your budget, give or take, for this current year, if you were to fund that through the stormwater utility instead of property taxes, it would be $15 a year per ERU. So when you add all of that up, you're getting to $50. So all of your cost over here and stormwater work on an annual basis, if it were in a stormwater utility, would be either $50 if the council chose to implement all 3, or it could be any 1 or 2 of them. That's really up to them. It's their choice, and they're going to look to you for some input and recommendation on that as well. So remember, look at this as almost 3 line items on a menu, and we're giving the council choices. We're saying, if you adopt a stormwater utility, do you want to fund A, B, C, or any combination thereof? And as I said earlier, C is the one that I like, because you can get a little more bang for your buck and leverage some grant money. Grant money is typically used for capital projects, bigger projects. So it's a way to basically extend your spending power, if you will.
So as we look at programs like a stormwater utility, I almost liken it to something that just comes in the life cycle of a city. As we age, there are certain things that we have to do at certain periods of time. And one of the things that we have mentioned a couple of times throughout this discussion are the number of other communities in the state that have a utility. It's nearing 200, and it's just a function of their life cycle. And so if we look at the map that's on your screen right now, these are our surrounding communities. While Bonita as a community certainly has a significant age, as an incorporated city, you're one of the youngest within the region. If we were to look at Naples, Fort Myers, and Cape Coral, which have been incorporated municipalities for many, many years, each one of those has established a stormwater utility system. So one of the things I do want to just point out as we look at these are kind of what are they charging their residents for having a stormwater utility. So why don't we start at the north? The city of Cape Coral, their ERU, so that's the equivalent of 1 single-family residential home, they charge $111 per home. When we move to Fort Myers, they're a little bit lower on that. So 1 ERU, which is your single-family residence, comes in right at $55 per home. And then we'll go to the south of the 3 communities around us that have an incorporated or have an established stormwater utility, and that's the city of Naples, and they charge $160 for a single-family home. So based on the slide that Tim had just gone over with you, here in Bonita, if you were to move towards a utility, you would look at anywhere between $9 and $50 for an ERU, which would be a single-family home. So now I would say, from my view, that looks like a bargain. You're the lowest ones out there, but it's a great start.
Now here's something that a stormwater utility can provide you that you can't get through property tax funding or gas tax funding, and that's the opportunity to issue credits. Now a credit is a recognition that you're doing something on site within your community or neighborhood to treat stormwater, which means the city doesn't have to come in and do it. So I live in a community where we've got a lake in the middle of it, and we'll show an example of another one. And so all of our stormwater goes in the lake, but I pay HOA fees to maintain that lake. So I'm already paying to maintain the water management system in my neighborhood. Now, my neighborhood is supposed to also be cleaning out all the catch basins and not sure we're doing all that as well as we should, but that's part of what we're supposed to be doing. So we're maintaining that, which means the city doesn't have to come in and do it. In a stormwater management systems, in a stormwater utility, you can recognize that with a credit. The second thing is that almost all systems, there's a few in the city of Bonita Springs that do not, almost all systems, when they manage your stormwater, that stormwater ultimately pops off. It goes somewhere. When the water rises, it hits that control structure, and it heads into predominantly a section of the city maintained system. So we all share a responsibility in making sure the city maintained system operates. So we kind of look at it in two tiers. You know, one level says, I manage the pre-treatment, and then it goes into the city system. And so how do these credits apply? To give you an idea, this is an example of a neighborhood similar to the one that I live in that you have a central lake. So all the water drains from the streets and houses into that lake. It's held temporarily in that lake until it rises through storm events. As it rises, it hits a control structure, and in this case, bleeds out to a canal to the upper right-hand side. Once the water hits the canal, it's the city's problem. It becomes their responsibility to maintain the courses from there to the ultimate outfall. That's how most communities work that have a stormwater system. Older communities, instead of having a stormwater system, the water drained to a ditch in the front of the yard, and that's within the right-of-way, and the city maintains all of that. So there's different ways out there. So a stormwater utility lets you recognize situations where the city does not have to do all the maintenance, and you can therefore issue a credit. So we look at it really in two levels. Level one is a typical community that may have been built in the last 10, 15, 20 years that has an on-site stormwater management system. We've looked at what that would save the city, and that saves the city about 15%. And so we would recommend that they issue a credit to those folks of 15%. Now, those communities also do need to maintain the system. So if you're not maintaining the system, you might lose that credit down the road. So it's kind of an incentive to do what you're supposed to be doing anyway. There are some communities in the neighborhood that discharge directly into tidal, or almost directly into tidal waters. In other words, they don't go through any part of the city system. Those properties would be eligible for up to a 50% credit. How we get to 50% on that is, you may remember the slide that Jared went over with you. Standing water on public roadways is a safety issue. Standing water anywhere is a health issue. So we have this backbone system that keeps our roads clear, keeps our streets dry, allows emergency vehicles to get access. It's about half of the city's budget to keep that backbone system going. And that system basically benefits all of us. So even if you discharge into tidal waters, your credit would be about 50%, and the other half would be there to support the backbone system as well. The only ones that are exempted fully by state law, and you can choose to exempt others if you wish, are bona fide agricultural operations. So and this doesn't mean that we had what we used to call rent-a-cow, where you had a piece of property on the corner and you'd throw a cow on it and you get an ag exemption. That's kind of gone away. You have to have a bona fide agricultural operation, which means the state has to issue a certificate that you are bona fide, and if you are, then you're not allowed to be charged fees such as this. In the city of Bonita Springs, there's not a lot of properties that fall into that category.
All right, so just a bit of a sort of a recap as this were, or if this were to go forward. The first is that a utility would apply to all non-exempt properties within the city, which basically means everything except for bona fide agriculture. The fee would be based solely on the impervious area on your property, or more or less what rain can absorb into or water can absorb into. It would be collected as a part of the non-ad valorem fee on your annual property tax bill, much like a solid waste fee that you see when you pay that every year. And if this is something that were approved, it would be included within the 2020 tax bill. So another full year out.
So where do we go from here? Well, we've got 2 more workshops. So if you enjoyed yourself so much tonight, you want to come back again. On February 11th, we'll be at the Bonita Springs Charter School, and I'll set up the sound system ahead of time there. So we'll be no more of that. But we're going to be at Bonita Springs Charter on February 11th, and on February 19th at Bonita Springs Fire Control. We then are going to, we've been appearing and updating the City Council on a monthly basis. We'll continue to do that. We'll be updating them in February as well. Just so you know, sense of timing. We have 2 purposes here tonight. One is to share information with you about what a stormwater utility is, what it may look like, what its potential fiscal impacts may be to you as a resident or as a business owner. But the other thing is we want to get information from you. So what we'd like to do now is to help us when we go to the city council kind of report back. You know, if you were to stand up and say, I'm all for this, and say, well, that's great, thank you very much, but I don't have anything to show anybody. So we're going to pass out comment cards, we're going to put pens on the table. When we're wrapped up here, what I'd ask each of you to do is to just put a brief comment or a long comment, whatever strikes you. If you think this is the greatest thing since sliced bread, say it. If you think the presenters were absolutely fantastic, write it twice. But if you think this is a terrible idea, if you think this is awful, you know, we want that input because it's your written input that allows us to record it and take it forward to the city council so they get a sense of where the residents of their community are on this. And so let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Go ahead and pass out the comment cards, if you would please, as well as the pens. I told you that when we wrapped up here, we also are going to move to the back of the room. If you have questions, we can handle those on an individual basis and talk to you person to person rather than doing it in a large group setting. Sometimes that's a little bit easier to do. Yes, ma'am?
This tax, would it be $9 per year per DRU, or, you know, what was that? Was that per month?
The fee as currently proposed is an annual fee. So if you said $9, that would be like category C. If you did that, it'd be $9 a year per ERU. It would be 50 if you do all three categories, and 9 if you just did category C. With that, the comment sheets are coming out. On behalf of the mayor and city council and staff, I want to thank you for coming tonight and look forward to hearing your opinions. And we will be in the back of the room with our microphones off if you have any questions.